right, welcome everybody to the launch of Sex Is As Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity by Paisley Currah. And Paisley will be joined by Kendall Thomas. What are you doing now? Now's not the time. And welcome to our virtual audience online. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the space you find yourself in right now. The Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And this is the service that we provide, is holding this space for queer culture, queer books, and queer people. So thanks for coming out tonight. Paisley's book is available by the register. And I'm going to get started by reading both Paisley's and Kendall's bios, and then we're going to jump right in. So Paisley Currah is a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Currah has written widely on transgender issues, including on topics such as discrimination, sex reclassification, and the transgender rights movement. He is the co-founder of the leading journal in transgender studies, TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. Currah has advocated for transgender rights at all levels of government. He was a founding board member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, served on the founding board of directors of Global Action for Trans Equality, and sat on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch's LGBT program. Kendall Thomas is the Nash Professor of Law and the director of the Studio for Law and Culture at Columbia University, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1984. He teaches and writes about law and culture, gender, sexuality and law, and critical race theory. He is a co-editor of Critical Race Theory, Key Writings That Founded the Movement from New Press, 1995. A scholar activist, Thomas is a co-founder of Amend the 13th, a social justice literacy initiative allied with the movement to amend the 13th Amendment and end enforced prison labor. Thomas is also a vocalist who has performed in several solo shows at Joe's Pub, at the New York Public Theater, and at MoMA PS1. So please welcome Paisley, and let's get started.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. It's a real pleasure to be here in this community cultural queer space. So I just want to talk tonight for a few minutes and just say a few things I figured out writing this book. One of the things I figured out is I'm the world's slowest thinker. It takes me a long time to figure out an idea, to understand what's happening, years, as you'll see. So I want to tell you a little bit about a piece of paper, like this aha moment I had that took 7 or 8 years to come to fruition. So it's people have aha moments and they're immediate. And my aha moment was it took 7 or 8 years. But anyways, but I want to tell you about it. So, and I know, so we can talk about New York City. New York City, for some odd reason, is its own birth certificate jurisdiction. So New York State, people born outside the city get birth certificates from the state. People born in the city get birth certificates from the city. And when I was working on this issue, we said, why are they different? And the city's administrative lawyer who was on our committee, she said, yeah, I've looked into that and I can't figure it out either. There's some historical reason that no one can remember. But anyways, in New York City, since the 1970s, so I'm going back 20 years. In New York City in the 1970s, the city had a policy where you could get a new birth certificate if you proved that you had convertive surgery, or which they meant genital surgery. And then they would give you a new birth certificate, but the new birth certificate would have no gender box on it. So there would be no box that said M and F. And when the city did that policy in the 70s, I think was a result of a lawsuit from the New York Civil Liberties Union. That was relatively progressive for the country, where a lot of the places wouldn't change birth certificates at all. But by the turn of the century, it was a very backward policy, where because it wouldn't change people's, wouldn't give them a new gender marker. So in 2005, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene created this ad hoc committee to kind of come up with a plan or a policy for new birth certificates. And that's where I got involved. The committee had people from the city, it had transgender health experts, had people like me, Dean Spade, people from the center, Carrie Davis, who worked here at the time, And the idea was to come up with a much more, policy that would be easier for transgender people to navigate. And we came up with a policy proposal, which was that the sex marker should be changed basically based on gender identity. The committee wouldn't agree to like just checking a box at that time, but if you could get some sort of letter from some sort of medical practitioner like affirming your gender identity, that would be the proposal. Interestingly, I think there was 2 surgeons on the committee, and at least one of them was against that policy. He thought the metric for changing sex should be surgery. It's not a surprise because he's a surgeon. But everybody else kind of agreed that gender identity would be the best policy. That was 2005, and we had this proposal, waiting for things to happen. And then it was just quiet and quiet and quiet. And finally in 2006, we heard back from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and they're like, you know what? We shopped this policy around other city agencies, and they didn't, so a lot of city agencies didn't like it. So we're gonna shelve it. So they had changed the policy to, you could get a new birth certificate with an M or an F on it if you had convertive surgery. So they basically changed the policy one little bit. You still had to have some sort of genital surgery, but then you would get something with an M or an F on it. So it was like not a very progressive policy for New York City. And then a few years later, transgender rights advocates, I think it's the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, they said, okay, we're gonna sue the city, and this is not okay. They said, they sued the city saying the policy is like arbitrary, capricious, discriminatory, and otherwise unlawful. Like they're just basically saying in the language of legal parlance that it didn't make sense. It was irrational. You can't have a capricious, irrational law. It's against the law to have a capricious, irrational law. This is when my aha moment kind of really started. Attorneys for the city responded, and they pointed out that the existence of different approaches to similar problems does not render an agency's rule irrational. And what they meant was to have different definitions of sex at the Department of Homelessness Services and the jails and the employment offices, to have different criteria for changing people's sex classification or for deciding what sex is. It's not irrational. So what they were basically saying was any one agency's policy for deciding who's male and who's female depended on the particular agency's work and not on some abstract idea about what the best or the most correct version of sex was. So trans advocates and city officials were talking back past each other. And just to be clear, the city officials on this policy were not like bad people, Republican, like we can talk about that later. They were like, public health people or like medical professionals who decide to like work for city government for relatively low pay. And they're like, they mean well. They're not like foaming at the mouth kinds of folks. But I realized that we were talking past each other. As trans advocates, we were making our claims in the register of like expertise and truth. Like we had a transgender health expert. We got a doctor from Cal Lord, and he was like, did a lot of transgender health, and he showed up in cargo shorts one time. And we're like, dude, you're a medical expert. You have to have some credibility. Can you like wear a suit, look look as nice as a surgeon from Columbia looks? And he was like, oh yeah, okay. But we had these kind of experts in truth, and we were working from the assumption that sex classification policy should be based on some kind of correct ideal definition of sex. But the representatives of the government, though, they were thinking of what they were kind of responding to us in the register of governing and politics. And their main concern was the practical consequences of changing the rules. And that's kind of where I realized that the bureaucrats were the real Foucauldians, in the sense that they understood that sex wasn't a thing in itself, but something that is like instrumentalized differently by different agencies. And that's kind of where I come up with the name of the book. Sex is as sex does. And the definition of sex changes depending on the context, and consideration of what sex does for different governing apparatuses have often had a far bigger role in determining the rules for sex reclassification than anything else. So I just want to talk a little bit about like different ways of looking at this problem. So trans advocates look at this problem as a question of like injustice and unfairness. And I do too as a trans advocate. Like the idea that the same person can be classified as an M by one agency and an F by another, it's a contradiction that seems unfair and unjust, and it creates problems for the person who they can't, prefer the right identity document at the right time. And then scholars, like trans studies scholars, academics, also myself included, like contradictions are bad and unjust, but in other sense, from an academic perspective, contradictions are like fun and sexy and like really fun to write about because you can deconstruct them and be all cool. So for academics, we think our task is to like identify the contradictions and deconstruct them and show that the position of the government is ideologically incoherent. But I was thinking about this is like, so activists are trying to point out, oh, they're unfair, and academics are just writing endless articles about how they're ideologically incoherent. But it's kind of like, I don't know if you get this reference, but it's like Honey Badger don't care. It's like an old YouTube. Like it doesn't matter to the state. And where I kind of got this idea was from Marxist cultural critic Stuart Hall, who argues, he was writing about Thatcherism in England. And Thatcherism was like, oh, small government, government in your bedroom, making sure you're not talking about sex and children. Like it was like ideologically incoherent, a lot of parts of Thatcherism. And Stuart Hall writes, in our own intellectual way, we think that the world will collapse as a result of logical contradiction. This is the illusion of the intellectual, that ideology must be coherent, every bit of it fitting together like a philosophical investigation. But actually merely highlighting the contradictions doesn't really mean the government's gonna fall apart. Like they're like, oh dear, we're contradictory. We're just gonna like, fold up and start doing things differently. Because what states do is like arrange and install difference and just give some people more things than other people. And that's like the essence of what it means to govern. So what I realized is like, I had this kind of methodological leap, and I thought, you know what? I don't know what sex is. I don't know. People have different narratives, and there's Judith Butler and all these people, and we said they're born in the wrong body. So I thought, what I'm going to do for this project, I'm just going to say that sex is whatever the government says it is. Like I don't really believe that, but it was a useful thing. So sex is what the government says it is, and that's why I use sex and not gender. So sex is a decision backed by the force of law. And if I just look at sex as an output, what can we figure out from that? So the idea then for me was to like, I'm not going to see these contradictions as unjust or ideologically incoherent. I'm going to see like, why do they exist? Like, let's go back and look into why they exist. So from that, so if we see that sex is just a decision, we can kind of try to understand how states are using different decisions to further their government policy. So, and one of the things that I realized doing this work is like, we're all really, really, really good at denaturalizing sex and gender. And like, after you've done, Women's Studies 101 as a student and taught it a bunch of times, maybe some of you have, like, that's like, it's fun, it's easy, and it's a great thing to do. But we're not so good at denaturalizing the state or even the market for that in some ways. So we get these really smart trans activists who understand that gender is like socially produced, but then go to a court or the state to ask the state do the right thing. And it kind of constructs the state as like some neutral night watchman or some umpire who's like dumb and befuddled and needs to have the right explanation of what sex is and everything will be fine. So what my project is asking us to do is kind of just like look at states more complexly. So in not holding sex, as I say in the book, in not holding sex steady in our grasp, whatever grasp that is, like Judith Butler or Born in the Wrong Body, we also kind of loosen our grip on the image of the state as some kind of edifice or personage or benevolent or slumbering night watchman who will make things right when prodded awake. So if we let go of our grasp of what sex really is, that means we have to let go of our grasp of the state too. Like we don't know for sure what the state is, but we might be able to figure out what it does. So one of the things that come across is that if we look at sex as a decision, we can see that there are different decisions. So maybe realize like we need to understand that these contradictions in policy are because we don't have one state. We have like many little governing authorities, like in the book, hopefully this won't turn anybody off. It's only a small part. But in the book, it's kind of like, there's this kind of like duty and deconstructive, like this forced law declaration violence. And like, that's true, except that if we put it away, it's like all over the place. Every different government agency can make that decision that like this makes this violent choice of like whether that baby is a boy or a girl. So the city was able to have agencies with different criteria for changing people's sex because it depended on what the agency was doing. And the most clear-cut example, it's not so much from the city, it's just from the policy analysis I did. Like in the early part of the century, a lot of the divisions of motor vehicles were changing their policies. They were like, making it easier. And departments of motor vehicles were much quicker and to change their policy so people could change the sex designation, and they are much quicker to lower their barriers to what counted as changing one's sex designation. So they're much quicker to get rid of surgical, any kind of body modification requirements. And they're much quicker to go to kind of an F or non-binary and all that sort of thing. So the purpose of an identity document, however, if you think about why are they making it easy, the purpose of an identity document is to establish a relationship between it and the person who carries it. So sex markers on the document that don't reflect the gender presentation of its holder weaken that connection. So if I get pulled over by the police for a ticket and I hand over a driver's license that indicates that I'm F, that doesn't really help the state recognize me and track me as I move across space, right? Because I look like my balding head and so on. I look, a little bit more on the male side. So because one of the things that the departments of vehicles do, they want to make sure people know how to drive and don't crash cars, but they're also a way to kind of track how people are moving across territory. So that's one of the reasons I thought that the sex designation policies, driver's license policies were easier. But at the very same time that the DMVs were making their policies easier, we get all these bad appellate decisions in the early 2000s involving marriage. So there was a bunch of people who, for bad luck, had their marriages challenged in court. Like a lot of marriages involving trans, this is before there was the war fell, before the ban on same-sex marriage was declared unconstitutional. There are marriages involving trans people. Most of them worked out fine. But when they didn't, when there was something to fight over through the marital contract, they didn't work out so fine for transgender people. So decisions about marriage, though, they're not about identifying someone. They're actually they're decisions about deciding who gets what. Because marriage, maybe we think of it as like, oh, you fall in love and you get married. Or maybe we think of marriage as this like legal instrument for ensuring that the transmission of property and all these other kinds of things. Like it has this ideological niceness around it, but it's really about regulating property transmission and other things. So as people like Nancy Codd and Peggy Pascoe have shown, marriage is and has long been an instrument of governing the terms, some individuals into families and families into nations by regulating the social reproduction, inheritance, property ownership, all this sort of time. So in these trans marriage cases, they would be, something would be an issue. So one would be a woman in Illinois or Indiana, Illinois, I think, who was married to a fellow and he died. And the fellow's son from an earlier marriage contested the estate. He said, I don't think she should get it because in fact she's transsexual, so she's really a man, so their marriage is really invalid. So she had changed all identity documents, done all that sort of stuff, and the court sided with the son. Another case was in Florida with this woman named Kristen Littleton. Her husband died in the hospital. She sued the hospital for malpractice, and the hospital's lawyers, who are like smart lawyers here, cagey smart lawyers, they're like, you know what? We don't have to defend this lawsuit the way in terms of malpractice. We're going to challenge her standing to sue. We're going to say she was born a man and she's in a same-sex marriage and she has no right to sue. And the highest court in Texas ultimately agreed with that. They said God cannot change a surgeon cannot change what God created at birth. It was very, what happened to the separation of church and state sort of decision. And that's another example where something is contested. And another example was this fellow named Michael Cantaras, and he and his ex-wife were fighting over custody. And she got some right-wing foundation lawyers, and they did the same thing. They said, we're going to say he's legally a female, and it was, they were never married, and so take away his custody rights, or his rights as a parent, because it was not a legal marriage. So in each of these cases, someone wanted to possess something generally conveyed by marriage. So the state, a wrongful death claim, custody of children, and the trans people lost. So when something was an issue, then people's gender identity wasn't recognized. So this is where I kind of see that we need to see sex as like almost like a mobile technology of governing. Like it just depends on what a stage is needed to be. So let me just wrap this up by going back to the beginning and going back to the policy in New York City now, which is a great policy. You just go, if you're born in the city, you just go fill a form, you say M, F, or X. That's New York City's policy. You don't need some doctor's letter. You don't need anything fancy. I think the states is pretty much the same now. There's no medical transition. There's no convertive surgery. All of that is gone, and that's a really great policy. And I certainly think it's excellent. And you could say, and people do say, that the policy came about because the city government became less transphobic. But I think like that's not the entire story. So in New York State, the ban on same-sex marriage ended in 2011. That was like one of the things that Cuomo did when he looked progressive because it didn't cost him any money. But the ban on same-sex marriage ended in 2011. And after that, city officials became much more open to this, to a standard of sex classification that didn't require surgery. Because before 2011, they were actually worried that like a cisgender man and another cisgender man, one of them would just say, one partner in that couple would say, "Oh, I'm a woman," and then they get married, and they would be, the state would have to recognize it as like an opposite sex marriage, but it was just two gay men or two lesbians kind of gaming the system. So the way I think we might want to look at this is that like the consequences, like once same-sex marriage became legal, the consequences of sex classification came to matter less and less. And there's so much less at stake in sex classification there used to be. The policies and policymakers and judges have gotten more relaxed about reform. But the thing with the New York City case is, it's not like every baby that is born just waits until it knows what it wants, an M or an F or an X, right? What the city's policy did is it addressed the really pressing needs of like binary and non-binary trans people who needed the right identity document to negotiate bureaucracies. At the time the mayor was Bill de Blasio, and he had a press release declaring his support, saying transgender and gender non-conforming New Yorkers deserve the right to choose how they identify and live with respect and dignity. So it was a good policy, but I see that policy. It's certainly not a transphobic policy, but it's really kind of takes place in the register of like identity politics. Here's a group, I'm going to give you the policy you want. Everybody else, sort of the universalizing side of the crowd, are still, babies are going to get an M or an F, depending on what the doctor says. So it's like an example of like, okay, this group gets exactly what it wants. And I think that's what's going on too, and with the Republican attacks on transgender youth in sports, in gender-affirming care, in curriculum, in bathrooms. It's like a mirror of the identity politics things that happen in New York. It's like a negative mirror of that, where transgender people, instead of having an identity group to be treated as a political constituency, are treated as kind of moral panic, folk devil. We have to stop this. We have to kind of get people upset and attack trans youth. So sex is no longer in the hands of bureaucrats, and it's not so much implicated in the architecture of governing. It's become weaponized very differently. And I think I'll stop there because I have some more things to say about what's going on now, but it might be nice to have a conversation. So, Kendall.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and so terrific to be in conversation with Paisley about his book. This is a book. This is a shameless plug for Paisley's book, but among the many things I like about this book is the cover and the way it's just screaming sex. I think we all know that it has something to do with sex, but you open the book and what you think it might be about very quickly is put in crisis. And I think that's really the main purpose of the project. Everything that you think you know about sex is put in crisis because the central question of the book is not the question that's preoccupied so many very smart people who think about these things, namely, what is sex? But the question is, how does sex work? How is sex put to work? Right? What does sex do? And that shift in focus, the framing of the question, sex is as sex does, I think makes this a tremendously important book. I am going to assume that I was asked to join you, at least one of the reasons I was asked to join you, is because I am trained in law and have spent much of my life thinking and writing and teaching law. And the book itself has what might be called a very legalistic understanding of how sex does what it does. Right? And the answer that you offer to that question is sex does what it does, at least the state does what it does with sex, by giving its definitions and classifications related to sex the force of law. Now, as someone who, like Paisley, is thoroughly steeped in queer theory and in postmodernism and all the other trendy ways of thinking and talking about sex and sexuality that are part really of our intellectual ecosystem, the first thing I want to say is that I found this shocking. One could say that Paisley is, for purposes of the thought experiment that he's conducting in this book, is embracing what Janet Halley and Wendy Brown in their book on left legalism call left legalism, right? That is the centering of law, legal ideology, and legal institutions as of interest, not only intellectually, but politically, right? Because the other thing you say is that the reason the state does what it does with sex is to further state projects. So the state is a state in part because it is a sexual state, and it is a sexual state in part because of what it does with sex. And we need to understand this question of why sex is what sex does from the point of view of the state. Now, I think it's important to underscore that this claim goes against the grain of decades now of dominant discourse in which people have proceeded on the assumption that the responsibility of intellectuals who, particularly intellectuals who understand themselves as allied with movements for social change, that the new movements for social change is to think about identity and maybe about ideology. Paisley, in part because of his location in the discipline of political theory, says, no, we have to pay attention. And what I'm going to do in this book is center for your attention, reader, the institution of the state and the state practices by which the state enacts, elaborates, and applies what it means to be a state through the practice of sexual definition and sexual classification. However, the project is not statist in the sense that people in the discipline would talk about it or would use that term, because the focus on specific, concrete, local practices by state actors is one that rejects from the get-go, as Paisley said, some grand theory of the state in the same way that his analysis rejects a grand theory of sex. So I'm incredibly sympathetic to this project of thinking the question of the relationship between sex and the state. Indeed, though this is not the question you asked, thinking about the ways in which the state itself is a sexual state. I am rather less sympathetic to the idea that understanding how the state defines and classifies using this category, sex, has to be or can only be understood in terms of law. That is, if by law, we're talking only about rules, policies, and administration in a narrow instrumental sense. Because one of the things that states do, for which I think the field of defining and classifying and sorting people by sex is an exemplary instance, is engage in practices of representation. And you mentioned Stuart Hall earlier, so I'll mention Stuart Hall, because when I use the word representation, I'm thinking of Stuart Hall's definition of that term, which he says entails the active practice of making things mean. And for me, an analysis of the government of sex, right? Of sexual governance through practices of state definition and classification needs to look not just at the practical, problem-solving, pragmatic, instrumental work of the state and what the state does with sex in that sense, but also needs to be alert to the domain of culture and the ways in which the state is both a site, an institution, and an instrument for practices of meaning making. And in the same way that meaning making, well, and that meaning making is a practice that involves, it's not sui generis, it's a practice that involves, let's call it for lack of a better term, a dialogue, a conversation, an exchange, an ongoing transaction with civil society. And that, it seems to me, is crucially important to remember in this particular moment. Why do I underscore that? Well, I do so because of the insistence that Paisley, with which Paisley argues not only that the only thing we can say for sure about what sex means is what a particular state actor says it means. I'll call that the Humpty Dumpty theory, right? Remember Humpty Dumpty says in Alice in Wonderland, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. But because Paisley also argues, insists, in fact, and I want to get this right, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, that we have to abandon the default assumption that transphobia is the cause of policies that harm trans people. We heard the story earlier about the well-meaning bureaucrats who were just trying to figure out a rational policy for addressing the problem of New Yorkers who wanted to have their birth certificates or their driver's license align with their gender identity. I think that the advantage of a theory of governance and a focus on practices of governing through sex in the United States, particularly in the current moment, this moment of illiberal neoliberalism, is that it is highlighting for us, particularly at the local level, the ways in which the boundaries of the state are quite porous, right? So the pluralism of state power is not just that it consists of practices engaged in by multiple state actors, but that its energy and its operation is informed by a relationship between the state, the formal institutions of the state, and state actors and powerful actors in civil society. And it may well be that we can talk about the exercise of state power in terms of technologies of governance without imputing a state of mind or intention, a psychology to the state. But we certainly can't do that when we look at the ways in which the right, you said you wanted to talk about the right has sought to capture state power for political projects which are driven by animus. So the first question I suppose I would ask is, what do you say about the limits of your analysis to readers who see your refusal to lean into what you call the transphobia animus argument as dangerous for intellectual and political reasons, or both? I was walking over here and listening to a recent show in which Laura Flanders was in conversation with Amara Jones of Translash. And their frame for why we should care about what Amara Jones, I think quite persuasively described as an epidemic of anti-trans legislation and organizing, which is more than 10 years old now, extremely well funded, is that it is weaponizing trans people are becoming a battleground, not just for culture wars, but for practices that are quite literally ideological weapons of death for trans people. And on one level, it doesn't matter if the state is partnering with these powerful right-wing political constituencies, or is being captured by these powerful right-wing constituencies, whether the state itself is acting out of animus or hatred. Because we know that the police power, that's a technical term in constitutional law, by the way, which, as Paisley writes in the book, has traditionally referred to the power of state and local government. It's power that belongs, by the way, only to state and local government, not to the federal government, to enact policies, laws and policies to protect the health, the safety, and the welfare and morals of people. But the summer of 2020, or since the summer of 2020, multiple constituencies all around this country have come to understand quite clearly that for many of us, the content of the police power is primarily punitive and is about control and criminalization, right? So if the state doesn't hate us, that's called comfort if the policies that the state is actually adopting are policies that entrench and consolidate the control of our bodies, right? So I'm quite aware that all intellectual work, right, takes place in a situation, right? So in the same way that you want to write about the ways in which the decisions about how to define and how to classify sex by the state are sectorally specific, topically specific, and have different and specific purposes, I think it's worth asking about the uses to which an argument that wants to bracket the transphobia, anti-trans animus energies that inform and propel and have, in the current moment, have led to a veritable explosion, right, in anti-trans, punitive anti-trans regulation. I'm concerned about the uses to which that argument might be put. Maybe the relationship between intellectual work about trans lives and political mobilization in response to the situation in which trans people find themselves and with which trans people in America are having to contend, right, is not a title, right? The intellectual is not just about, the role of the intellectual is not just to be an advocate for a movement. There's value to taking some distance and trying to think through hard questions in ways that make people uncomfortable. But I do think that it's worth asking whether, and if so, in what precise ways we lose something when we bracket the question of transphobia animus in favor of a focus on technologies of governance. Is there a sense in which that formalism is in tension with the realism that says sex is whatever the government says it is? Well, that's true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Not that you claim it does. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it may be missing important parts of the story that in this moment, right, for a book of the kind that you've just written in this moment, how do I want to put this? Doesn't tell the whole story. You're not trying to tell the whole story, right? You're quite clear about bracketing a whole set of other questions that might be taken up. But to focus on state definition classification on the basis of sex, or the use of sex definition and sex classification in a way that doesn't toggle, to use your own verb, toggle back and forth, right, between the formal state and agents of the state who may not be formal state actors, but are exercising state power, right? Have captured the state. Think about, you know, the DeVos family, the Mercer family, and the Kochs, these large private powers who in effect have captured state control and are sponsoring these campaigns that are aimed at purging, to use Donald Trump's term, purging gender ideology, as they call it from the state. Can't we hold on to an analysis of technologies of governance at the same time and understand the ways in which the mobile, shifting, shape-shifting character of state practices of definition and classification are always occurring in a context and in concert with the active work of making trans mean. I'll shut up after this. There's one of the things that Amar Jones mentions in this show with Laura Flanders is that right after the Uvalde shooting, apparently images of the young man, the 18-year-old who killed those children in the school, were altered to make the young man look transgender. And those images were married to narratives about the threat of transgender people to children. So it doesn't really matter if they were, you know, animated by animus or hatred. The work they're doing is work whose consequences are likely to be deadly for trans people in Texas and perhaps all over the country. So I'll just put that out there and see what you want to do with it.
Okay, well, there's so much there. Thank you so much, Kendall, for those comments, because they really kind of bring to light some of the things the book wanted to do. Like, I don't think I ever say transgender is never, or transphobia is never the answer as an explanatory thing. But like, I'm really trying to like kick people as hard as possible out of the logic of identity politics. Like, everything is either transphobic or not transphobic. So the reason why I decided to just say sex is a decision of governments is like, then if we just kind of see that as an output and not an input, oh, they've come in this idea and they think sex is designed at birth, and that's what the Republicans, you know, classify people as. We don't really understand the complexity of what's going on. But when I certainly don't do cultural studies, I do culture, but what I talk about in the book is that gender is super important, and gender refers to like these histories, traditions, narratives, or arrangements for distributing privilege differentially. And those gender narratives are what inform state constructions of sex. So most clearly in marriage, right? Because marriage is about maintaining hierarchical gender relations for power. So that's a cultural narrative that informs the state constructions of sex. I decided not to use the word gender though, because I want to save gender as this larger analytical category that we can draw on to understand like how marriage laws and gender and Nancy Cott and all that stuff informs policy. So like even in New York City with like the nice bureaucrats, they wanted to be nice to transgender people, but ultimately they were foiled by the fact that we were discussing changing the rules for sex classification when we still had a ban on same-sex marriage. So they were like ultimately, you know, representing the state's interest in keeping marriage as this kind of distribution and mechanism that keeps same-sex couples out. So I'm never saying that we can't understand the Republican animus right now against trans youth as transphobic. Paul Gossar, a bunch of us wrote an op-ed, I don't think it ended up anywhere, about that, where Paul Gossar said the shooter was a transsexual, illegal alien leftist. It was a different order, but it was all those things wrapped up in there. And it's so perfect because it's like Marx, the German ideology, right? It's like ideology is like, it takes material reality and it captures it, and then just turns it totally upside down. So like the person, and then there was all this discourse about how hormone blockers are causing this shooter to do these bad things. And then somebody else tweeted, some conservative said, oh, it's the attack on toxic masculinity. That's what stopped the police from going in, because these feminists kind of took away their masculinity and they didn't want to be brave anymore. So like we could hear and say, we could think like, well, if we want to read the shooting and masculinity and gun culture, there's like more obvious direct ways to read that. So, but what I'm not doing in this book is trying to kind of discount transphobia. But I guess, and this is like sort of unpopular because transphobia is like a commodity, right? It is like, you talk about transphobia and it's clear and we all know it exists and it's totally understandable and it fits into this kind of identity politics logic. And so all these terrible bills and the way Republicans are weaponizing trans identity, it's a crisis, it's terrible. But if we just focus on transphobia, we lose back to the fact like where the blue states are in crisis, right? Like not having national health care, not having this vast income inequality, having this massive prison industrial complex. If we got rid of all those things, as much as we possibly could, those policy changes would do so much more to help transgender people than any like non-discrimination law. So it's kind of like when people were talking about Trump and Trump is a fascist, he's so bad. It makes the Democrats look like they're great, but they're not. They're not. Like the normal is also bad. And I guess, so in my book, I'm trying to kind of get people to remember, like, of course, this new weaponized transphobia is like, it's like extremely terrible, but we have to be able to hold both things in our minds at once. What is also terrible is like the slow degradation of people's life chances in even nice blue states, right? So like, that's what I'm trying. And it's like, it's not popular because everyone wants to talk about transphobia to Republicans, and but for me, I just want to kind of like keep both those political goals in mind.
It's not just about Republicans, by the way. Right?
Oh yeah, it's not just the Republicans. No, it's definitely not just the Republicans, but they're sort of the extreme version of it. I mean, and it's just like a classic moral panic. In Texas, like 250 people die when their electrical grid fails, and Governor Abbott's legislative priority that year is to pass a bill attacking trans kids. And I looked it up recently, they still didn't fix the electrical grid because they don't want to, because they, I don't know, money, power, politics. So there's a kind of classical scapegoating of trans people and the gender ideology, but I think we can't see that as totally divorced from the normal. And from, like we can see with the attack on abortion, the attack on Roe. I mean, Republicans and folks who want Roe to go away, they're bringing back the gender hierarchy, right? They want women to have less life chances, and people who get pregnant, but the Republicans are focusing on women. They want people who get pregnant to have less, life opportunities and have no control of the reproductive system and be forced to carry pregnancies to term. And Amy Coney Barrett say, oh, it's like nothing. You just give a pregnant, and Alita, just be pregnant and then drop it off at some of these fire stations, everything will be fine. It's like, there's like, Michael Powell had a piece, he's like a shit stirrer, in the Times a couple of days ago about how trans people are taking away womanhood of abortion. It's like, who's taking womanhood of abortion? The judges, the justices, because they're forgetting what it's like to be pregnant and what it's like to carry a child to term and the massive physical, social, psychical, physical costs of being pregnant. That's who's erasing women. So I guess what I'm just trying to, kind of keep in mind is like the normal, this isn't so much, but the normal is not so great either. So, and that's why I want us to kind of like pay attention to like, even like politicians who like are appealing to our identity politics interests, because well, de Blasio lets trans people choose X on whatever, and Governor Hochul is letting people choose X. That's all great, but like, wouldn't it be better if we got rid of the carceral complex of upstate New York? Or wouldn't it be better if we actually decided to try to create some kind of public payer healthcare plan? So that's sort of the political economy thrust of my ideas on that.
Mm-hmm. I'm completely sympathetic to everything you say in the book about the limits of identity as an organizing frame and ground for political mobilization and practice. And I'm very sympathetic to the parts of the book that with great sophistication connect trans struggles for freedom to other struggles, most specifically the struggles of women for full and equal participation in our common life in this country. I am very sympathetic to the alignment of the book with scholars and activists who have noted the ways in which confining political interests and organization to questions of recognition leaves a whole host of issues having to do with distribution and redistribution and political economy off the table, and does nothing to address the realities of life in the carceral state, a state which does not affect all trans people equally, but which is articulated with race and with class in ways that a single lens focus on trans identity obscures and actually becomes complicit in. I agree with all of those things. So I just want to be clear about that. I do understand, though, the thought experiment, right? Can we generate an account of how sex works within the state that doesn't automatically impute harmful policies that harm trans people to transphobia? But here, and this is the next move I make, there are a whole host of attitudes, psychological orientations that aren't about animus that I do think complicate the picture in ways that, for me at least, still require us to attend to the psychic life of power, to use Judith Butler's phrase. And so let's take the Democrats. The Democrats may be defenders of trans recognition and allies in trans identity politics, but behind that attitude is kind of cynicism. But if we assume that these technologies of governance are just practices that are animated and informed by attitudes, beliefs that aren't just about administration or policy, right, but have cultural valence and value, then it seems to me that we also need to pluralize the range of attitudes, beliefs, et cetera, that inform the practices of decision makers, so that it's not just reason, right? And trying to do the most rational thing, right? But it's also about emotion, broadly construed, right? So I'm thinking about what I'm insisting on, I guess, is, can I say not throwing the baby out with the bathwater? The need to account for the psychic life of state power, right? Even if we bracket the question of transphobia and transphobic animus, to map the movement of the ways in which the deployment in specific situations for specific purposes of sex classifications is also about ideologies, attitudes, and the like, even if they're not reducible to animus, even if, for example, they're about nothing more than a kind of cynicism. Identity politics is a game. You have to play identity politics because this is one of our constituencies, or it's a group of people that our constituencies care about. Therefore, it doesn't cost us much. So, trans lives matter, right? We'll brand that, right? Amazon will brand it, right? Everybody will brand it, right? And as long as it doesn't cost us anything and doesn't require us to think about the political economy, say, of gender capitalism in the same way that anti-racist activists are forcing us to think, for example, about the relationship between racial capitalism and the carceral state, right? So that's the point I guess I'm really trying to zero in on. This question of the inner life of state power, the psychic life of state power, and the ways in which, in the same way you want to pluralize sex, I want to pluralize a state, we can retain an account of the psychic life of power that doesn't reduce that psychic life to animus, but is nonetheless alert to the ways in which these technologies of governance are, to paraphrase Foucault, a dense conductor, right, of affect, attitudes, and the like, emotion, even, right, across the political spectrum.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And I guess what I would say is, I don't do the psychic life of power, the psychic life of the states, but I use, like as I said before, I think of gender, and a good way to think about this now is like this kind of construction of gender ideologies, this boogeyman of all the bad stuff, like same-sex marriage and gay sex and transgender people, and actually women, overeducated women. I think Matt Getz calls them. I had some think about that. So I'm not. So I guess I'm really interested in. I guess as an activist, as an advocate, and meeting with government officials, I was always surprised. Even looking at archives, where I was often surprised by a lack of disgust, like a lack of oh, this is disgusting. Let's just make these people go away. Like I remember finding some letter from 1968, some official of the Department of Health and Human Welfare. It's like, this is an interesting question if people change their sex. But it's going to change how benefits are administered between men and women. So we really need to think about that. So I think I went into the project expecting there's going to be disgust and transphobia and animus. And instead I found they're thinking basically about money. That's what states think about. And then money is dictated by whatever gender arrangements are in place. Like men always get more stuff than women until the state has to pay. Then they don't, right? Then the state, then they go after fathers for child support, right? Like that's one of the few places where fathers don't have the same, fathers are gone after the state because it's about money. So I guess I'll just stick to the thing. I think anyways, I guess animus is not my specialty. I like looking at the boring, concrete political economy of who gets what. But I think maybe it's time to open it up for questions and discussions since we've been talking at you for so long. Yes.
Hi, so I'm not a legal person, I'm a classicist, but I think my experience in my extremely traditional classicist department at Columbia, is relevant here. Classics is an extremely ideological field. It's a field that's also about process, right? It's about these very specific things that you have to be able to do, have to be able to translate text. You have to prove your pedigree because that's the way this field works. And in some ways, I think it's a good sort of analog of this question about human emotion and human personality engaging with a set of structured rules that are passed down for generations. And I wonder if there's sort of a middle place between this sort of objective, like account person and this, like, you know, virulent transphobe. There's like a spectrum where you can have someone who, like, has been affected by this like transphobia in some ways, like, and because that's the discourse, and then they don't realize it, they think they're rejected. And like someone who knows that what they're doing is affected by that, and doesn't prioritize, you know, the choices that they're making. And I think that that type of spectrum is something like kind of in the middle of what we've been speaking to. I've noticed it in my own department, that's why I'm saying it. So I wonder if you both think that there might be kind of a middle ground between this field of like structure and like personality, where they affect people like kind of in that way. And I think there's another point I would make there is that these are always people who like don't have actual investment information. Like this is never going to be the trans lawyer, right? Like this is never going to be the trans for the gay professor. Like it's always someone who has a choice about whether or not they want to invest ideologically in this problem.
Yeah, no, it's so they're always going to be in some sense structured by the reigning gender regime, and you know, even if they're just technocrats. But I think what is interesting, if you look at all the policies that trans people have changed, you know, over the decades around identity documents, or you know, or getting policy, getting administrative rulings that saying the sex includes gender identity. They're always done at the sub rosa bureaucratic level of meetings, right? They are never public. It was never something even legislators were even vaguely aware of. So I see the division, I think, maybe between like now legislators, like regular people who don't like trans people who are elected are like, what the hell? Like, what is going on in my state? So it's a little bit of an attack on like what the Trump would call the deep state or the administrative state, right? Where they're just kind of boring people. They're not the greatest people, they're just boring technocrats. And that's being ripped out of their decision-making power now. It's being politicized where you have like bills now. Like, so all these, even in certain states, these technocrats would change the birth certificate policies, right? And then the legislators are like, what? In my state? And they're trying to pass a bill that says, oh, it has to, birth certificates can only be based on birth sex. So I think I see that the division you're talking about is like between like the technocrat, bureaucrat folks and the elected officials who are like becoming aware, and they're becoming aware of these transitions because of this whole well-funded right-wing architecture, and like they're getting, the right wing getting much better at paying attention to the cracks and crevices of the regulatory state. Like they're just so much better at figuring where to go. And I think that is the new danger. But that's a really good observation.
I would just call it the unconscious, right? I want to say that we can undertake a cultural analysis of the state because of the reasons I was saying earlier, because the state is not just about rational administration, legislation, and adjudication. The state is also both a site for cultural representation and is itself a cultural form. And that reality, it seems to me, requires some ongoing engagement with the question of the ways in which, and Stuart Hall gets this, I think, very right, the state and the domain of the political can only be understood if we attend to issues of imagination, and the state as both an instrument and an arena that invites us to imagine ourselves in certain ways. But bureaucrats are doing that as well, right? So, you know, the county clerk who refuses to issue a marriage license, even when the law requires them to do it, right? Because they're invited to imagine themselves, and not as a bureaucrat, but as, you know, a Bible believer who takes their religion with them everywhere they go. Right? In that moment, that individual is not just a representative of the state, but is the state. And there's a collapse of the sphere differentiation between religion and the state, say, right? My public self, my private self, that I think capture this moment in which identity organizes the whole of social life, right? Because the way we imagine ourselves as members of a body politic, of a shared political society, is through these identitarian categories, which cobble together these different modules, which in the classical liberal account are thought to be consigned to distinct and different regimes of social life. So the complexity and messiness, I love that word, use it more than once, the messiness of this moment inheres precisely in the ways in which the whole of our social and political life has been colonized by the language of identity. And we forget that there used to be other ways of talking about politics and the state that didn't go through identity, at least identity as we understand it, and make the urgency of, the cultural unconscious or the political unconscious, and the analysis of that, and the ways in which we need a dialectical understanding of the rules, the rhetoric, and the logics of state power that attend to the ways in which the psychic life of power mediates all of these practices in ways that will elude us if we don't remain alert to them.
Yeah. Other questions or ideas or comments or solutions?
Besides revolution.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to get in there somewhere, but I didn't have time to, but I think one thing we want to do is like not get drawn into the terrain that the right wing wants to draw us into, like having a battle over what sex is, like the right definition of sex. Because like there's no right definition of sex that's going to work for every person in every situation. And I think one of the things that's happened with the politicization of what bureaucrats used to do is it's gone into the political realm, but that still provides us with an opportunity because we can focus instead on like the definition of sex, we can focus on the harm that these policies are doing. Like, is it really necessary to make sure that middle school trans kids can't play sports? Is there really something that's like, there's a crisis that means those girls can't play sports? Do we really have to have like a 7th grade volleyball team member be governed by the Olympic sports rules for sex testing? Like, so I think what we need to do is like not get drawn into like what sex is, it's chromosomes, it's hormones, but focus on the context and the harm and turn the attention around. And I think what the advocates are doing in their lawsuits against these really terrible policies in Alabama and Texas where they're criminalizing the provision of gender-friendly medical care, is they're focusing on the harm the criminalization is doing. They're turning it around. And sadly, it's very easy to find people who have been harmed. I mean, there was a case in Texas where Governor Abbott said, we're gonna investigate all these bad people. This trans kid tried to commit suicide. He goes into a psych unit. Psych unit people learn that he is on puberty blocker or something, or he wants to transition. And then they call the government in to investigate his family. Right. So it's just like, and once you start telling those stories to people, I think they understand that, oh, maybe this gender ideology thing is a little bit, maybe that's not such, maybe we shouldn't worry about that. We need to worry about the harm that's being done to these kids. So I just think we do need to stay concrete and local and try and not get drawn into some larger debates about sex and gender.
Because we'll never win those.
No.
So I take it you think Ketanji Brown Jackson made the right choice in the hearings?
She said, what's sex?
She was asked, what is a woman?
She goes, it depends. And like, that's what public health folks are saying too. There's like this new kind of work that Sarah Richardson and people are doing up at Harvard from their public health, they're sciencey people. But it's like, we just need to look at the context. Like, do we need to have a gender on people's birth certificate? No. Does the government want to keep track of how many people who are assigned female are born? Maybe. You know, like, there's a context. Like, when you're talking to like trans youth in the city, do you need, or do youth in the city, do you need to know who's male and who's female? No. If you're doing HIV education, sure, maybe you want to know what body parts they have and where they put them, and talk about safe sex in ways that are not like othering and gender weird, you know? So like, so when we talk about sex, we have to focus on the harm and the context and not getting some pure battles about definitions. So.
And I would urge you again to order, ideally from this bookstore, which has a website.
Yeah.
Do you do online orders?
Yep.
Which does online orders. And I can assure you that you will be challenged and rewarded by the stories and the arguments in this brilliant book by my friend Paisley Currah. That was my second shameless plug. But it's a terrific book, which really, I think, will stimulate discussion, not just in the academy, but among advocates and activists about how sex does what it does. So thank you, Paisley, for this intellectual feast.
Thank you so much, Kendall. It was a great conversation. So thanks for having me.
Thank you both so much. And yes, you can get that at bgsqd.com.